My name is Melanie, and I'm continuing to read Race in the City, which is a compilation of essays edited by Henry Louis Taylor Jr. I've read the preface, and now I'm going to start reading the introduction. Introduction, Race in the City, 1820 to 1970. And this gives some very good historical information about the city of Cincinnati, where I currently live. The history of Black Cincinnati from 1820 to 1970 is a narrative about the stages and determinants of Black community development and about the internal and external forces that shaped the Black experience over time. Both continuity and discontinuity characterize the history of Black Cincinnati. Some things changed in dramatic ways, while other things remained essentially unchanged. Antebellum Cincinnati is the reference point in the chronicle. It is the backdrop against which changes that took place in the city and in the Black experience are described, analyzed, interpreted, and explained. The antebellum pre-industrial commercial city. Black Cincinnati formed in a booming river town with a social world characterized by Negrophobia, proscription, segregation, and the constant threat of violence. Denied citizenship and protection under the Constitution of the United States, Blacks faced legal, political, and social restrictions in their quest for freedom. Therefore, Black Cincinnatians had to create their community in a city offering expanding economic opportunities, yet tinged with the stench of racism. Within this protean setting, African Americans sensed that they could survive Cincinnati only by fashioning their lives in an environment put together by independent organizations reflecting their concept of being a people filled with pride, confidence, and self-determination. White friends were important, but to secure real freedom, Blacks had to rely on their own resources, not benevolence. They had to build organizations, forge a group identity, and act in their own interest. Operating within this philosophical context, African Americans built churches, schools, benevolent organizations, orphanages, homes for widows, and secret societies, including stations on the Underground Railroad. The leaders of these organizations and institutions were drawn from the ranks of the groups in the community with the most stability and the highest status. They were elites, dominated by skilled workers and business people, most of whom were barbers, carpenters, hucksters, teachers, painters, tanners, and whitewashers. These Black leaders were usually democratically elected at citywide meetings. Thus, the Black masses, not white patrons, formed the social base of their power. Consequently, antebellum leaders did not become an isolated elite, out of touch with the Black community. See Chapter 3. The Black residential structure reinforced this pattern of leadership. African Americans lived in a series of residential clusters scattered throughout the city. These clusters formed without reference to class, family structure, nativity, or stage in the life cycle. See Chapter 4. Therefore, those who spoke and acted on behalf of Black Cincinnati lived among the masses. Proximity and social interaction reinforced the bonds of unity between leaders and their constituencies and helped to explain the vitality of Black organizational life. The struggle against racism and the abolition of slavery stood at the center of the African American experience. Yet Blacks did not simply react to whites. They formed their own culture, developed their own worldwide worldview and fought constantly to control their own destiny. This is what young John Mercer Langston and other youths observed when they walked the streets of Antebellum, Cincinnati. They saw black men and women against great odds building a tightly knit community and establishing themselves as skilled workers, entrepreneurs, property owners, and leaders fighting for freedom. See Chapter 2. Still, African Americans lived on the edge in Cincinnati. Although the Queen City was a prosperous place, most blacks did not gain access to many of the jobs and opportunities there. A color caste occupational system existed in Cincinnati. Its segmented labor market not only featured different types of jobs for men and women and children, but it was partitioned along racial lines. Institutions such as government, education, and trade unions, and white employers and workers outside the unions colluded to perpetrate the colored and white sections of the labor market. This resulted in the floor of the white economic opportunity becoming a ceiling for black economic opportunity. Racism, not human capital deficits, created the obstacles encountered by African Americans in Cincinnati's labor market. See Chapter 5. Nevertheless, a handful of blacks achieved phenomenal economic success. Robert Harlan made a fortune buying and selling racehorses. Robert Gordon captured the imagination of a generation with his exploits in the coal business. Thomas Schooley had a successful pickling establishment, and Alfred V. Thompson ran a thriving tailoring business. Presley Ball and Alexander Thomas were well-known photographers, and Samuel T. Wilcox succeeded as a grocer. Henry Boyd manufactured and owned the patent for a popular pre-Civil War corded bed. Remarkable and inspirational, these great individual accomplishments, nevertheless, did not reflect the realities or the possibilities available to most blacks. The color caste occupational system and openly hostile forms of racism, including violence and discrimination, kept the vast majority of African Americans securely locked in the lower chambers of the city's economic structure. Race and class played a major role in determining where blacks lived in the city. In the antebellum period, however, Black Cincinnati was not a territorial community with specific boundaries, and no one perceived African American culture or behavior as connected to the particular place, quote unquote, as a physical/social environment occupied by blacks. When people use terms like Little Africa and Bucktown, they were identifying where large clusters of African Americans and their institutions were located, not making statements about the relationship between the physical or social environment and black behavior. See Chapter 4. What I'm reading is filled with footnotes. It gives the number with reference to the footnote at the end of the introduction. This is not surprising. African Americans were spatially integrated into the entire city. Although white prejudice, discrimination, and hostility infiltrated every aspect of life in Cincinnati, racial residential segregation did not exist. Blacks were concentrated, but did not live in homogeneous, racially segregated neighborhoods. They shared the living space with whites from various ethnic groups and social classes. The houses of the rich and the hovels of the poor stood within a stone's throw of each other. Many blacks and whites huddled together in wretched neighborhoods, and almost everywhere dwelling units coexisted with stores, offices, shops, warehouses, and factories. No one group could claim the living place as its own. In such a setting, the riveting of African American behavior to place could not occur. And there's a footnote for that. It also says see chapter 4. So, of course, these footnotes give you the source of the information from which that statement came. So what I'm saying by noting the footnotes here is that all of the information contained can be referenced to another source. Finally, it would be a mistake to conclude that the pervasiveness of racism meant that blacks were consumed with white machinations in this or any other period in Cincinnati's history. African Americans lived in a social universe apart from whites. The sights, sounds, smells, rhythms, melodies, and improvisations of Black life existed independent of the white world and gave shape, form, texture, and vibrancy to Black Cincinnati. In the intimate atmosphere of home, church, and the backroom bar, Blacks loved, told stories, joked, laughed, sang, danced, and enjoyed friendships without conscious thought of whites, racial hostility, and the ever-present threat of violence. This is another heading in the introduction: Race, Class, and the Rise of the Industrial Metropolis. In the decades following the Civil War, African Americans flocked to Cincinnati, hoping to build a better life for themselves and their families. Before the war, Blacks viewed slavery, their lack of citizenship, and their inability to participate in the political process as the cornerstones of prejudice, discrimination, and segregation. With slavery abolished and the legal fetters of racism broken, Blacks expected Negrophobia, proscription, discrimination, and segregation to retreat. They were mistaken. Obstacles to their full participation in American society remained in force. Black Cincinnatians' quest to transform their dreams into reality and the thwarting of those efforts are dominant themes in the post-bellum experience. Economic restructuring looms large in the growth and development of Cincinnati after the mid-19th century. Industrialization was the driving force behind the change process. The value of Cincinnati's manufactured products, for example, increased from $54 million in 1851 to $262 million in 1910. The developing economy spurred population growth, including an influx of Southern Blacks. Between 1850 and 1940, the total population increased from 115,438 to 455,610, while Blacks shifted from 3,172 to 37,222, and went from comprising 3% of the population to 18%. Meanwhile, the city expanded its territorial boundaries from 6 to more than 52 square miles. See Chapter 6. The Queen City's transition from a compact settlement with an economy centering on the waterfront and on steamboat traffic to a sprawling industrial city with a diverse manufacturing base brought havoc into the lives of many workers. For example, as the pace of industrialization accelerated in the 1870s and 1880s, the workplace changed for individual workers. The small workshop was transformed into the modern factory. Production was reorganized and rationalized, mechanized, increased dramatically. Mechanization, increased dramatically. A sharp division of labor emerged, and many jobs became highly specialized. Both the number of occupations requiring highly skilled workers and those requiring little or no skills proliferated. See Chapter 5. The change process eroded the old ways of life and marginalized large segments of the working class. Not only did numerous jobs and opportunities disappear, but many workers, especially craftsmen, lost status. They became obsolete in a rapidly changing world. Yet the greatly expanded economy did produce new jobs and opportunities. In the newfangled industrial world, a different category of workers achieved status. For example, machinists, clerical, sales, professional, and white-collar positions gained prestige. Moreover, the growth of industries in such areas as foundry and machine shops, liquors, clothing, slaughtering and packing, boots and shoes, printing and publishing, carriages and wagons, soap and lumber products created a great demand for skilled workers and laborers. See Chapter 5. There's also a footnote there. Cincinnati did not keep pace with its competitors, but the city still thrived. Black workers, however, did not fare well. The Civil War abolished slavery, but left the color caste occupational system intact. Racism and negrophobia continued to circumscribe the jobs and opportunities available to African Americans. Moreover, the progress that blacks did make resulted from occupational filtering, not a free labor market. As the expanding economy produced new jobs, whites moved up the occupational ladder. The jobs that they did not want filtered down. This occupational filtering became the primary vehicle for black achievement during the Industrial Age. See Chapter 5 and footnote. The experience of the Irish, a downtrodden group in Antebellum, Cincinnati, provides one measure of how whites benefited from industrialization. The Irish, who had held lowly positions in the waterfront in the commercial era, made significant gains during the industrial period. By 1890, significant proportions of Irish-born men and women had jobs as clerical and sales workers, traders and dealers, blacksmiths, masons, policemen, and workers in the iron and steel, cigar, and boot and shoemaking industries. None of these categories were important for black workers. See Chapter 5. In fact, blacks actually lost occupational ground during the period. For example, their monopoly on barbering disappeared. Black entrepreneurs attracted fewer and fewer white customers. With the dismantling of the colored school system, the elite core of black teachers declined. The increasing number of black men and women were forced to take jobs as unskilled and semi-skilled laborers and domestic servants. By 1920, 86% of black Cincinnati worked as unskilled laborers and domestic and personal servants. There were no black bankers, brokers, moneylenders, wholesale dealers, importers, exporters, city officials, or inspectors. See Chapter 6. The black middle class was very small, and its income base fragile. For instance, blacks comprised only 2% of professionals and 2% of proprietors, managers, and officials. The most black professionals were ministers, musicians, and teachers of music, not doctors, dentists, lawyers, judges, mechanical engineers, editors, and reporters. See Chapter 6. Blacks remained at the bottom of the occupational ladder. Everything had changed, but everything had remained the same. Still, the economic gains made by blacks were important. Proletarianization, this is the creation of a black industrial working class, and the growth of the black middle class strengthened the black community. This small group of entrepreneurs, professionals, social workers, teachers, industrial workers, I don't know if that, I will have to edit that. I don't know if that blacked out or not. The screen did. Okay. So, the small group of entrepreneurs, professionals, social workers, teachers, industrial workers, Pullman porters, and federal employees formed the critical core of black leadership during the industrial age. And my grandfather, Thomas Horner, worked on the railroad. I believe he was a Pullman porter. The college-educated black, in particular, became a major force in the community building effort. Even so, the low wages and the limited range of opportunities stunted the development of Black Cincinnati, distorted its class structure, and made both class and race determinants of the life changes of blacks. Footnote. The place of class and race in fashioning the life chances of African Americans is most clearly reflected in their quest to find good housing and good neighborhood conditions. African Americans migrating to Cincinnati in the late 19th and early 20th centuries entered a city whose physical environment was being structurally reorganized. Not only were separate zones being set up for commercial and industrial activity, but the residential environment was being reshaped. In the old walking city, the rich and poor had lived near each other. Big mansions and rickety shanties had coexisted. Mosaic best described these neighborhoods, where a collage of people and houses shared space. The industrial city altered this pattern. Neighborhoods became increasingly segregated on the basis of housing type and cost. Low incomes, coupled with this reorganization of the residential environment, limited the housing options of African Americans. See Chapter 6. Mass homeownership and residential land use regulations were the driving force behind this change process. As the population grew and the transportation revolution made city expansion possible, people moved into neighborhoods that were emerging in the space between the basin and the city's boundary line. This space became the center of residential development in the years between 1880 and 1940. Footnote. A residential building boom accompanied population growth in these emergent neighborhoods. The owner-occupied single-family house became the dominant type of structure. Between 1900 and 1938, 84% of the new residential buildings constructed in Cincinnati were single-family dwellings. Most owner-occupied. The number of people who owned their homes increased dramatically, and ownership changed residents' attitude toward the living place. They wanted to keep out people or establishments that might threaten their investment. See Chapter 6. As new communities emerged in the hilltop and valley region, neighborhoods in the basin deteriorated. The area became a volatile land use conversion zone as it turned into Metro Cincinnati's economic center. Industrial, commercial, and government activity replaced residential development as the predominant form of land use. At the same time, housing costs in hilltop and valley neighborhoods kept many low-income workers from leaving the basin. But housing costs alone could not keep low-income workers out of the emerging middle-income residential areas. Cincinnati had land speculators, lenders, building materials companies, and an army of carpenters who catered to low-income workers. This made it possible for these workers to invade neighborhoods with expansive owner-occupied houses. In the industrial city, the regulation of residential land use without laws did not work. In an unregulated residential environment, workers could buy cheaply developed lots and build inexpensive, poorly constructed homes on them. Moreover, industrial and commercial enterprises could locate in thriving middle-income neighborhoods and, if they felt the need, build modest cottages for their workers. Housing leaders felt that these forms of residential land use threatened home ownership and the development of homogeneous neighborhoods. Footnote. They believed that middle-income communities had to be protected from invasion by low-income workers and commercial and industrial establishments. This is a quote. It would be a short-sighted policy to encourage the construction of small homes and to foster home ownership, and at the same time fail to take every precaution to see to it that the resident district are not properly protected, unquote, said the Better Housing League in its 1921 annual report. As a result, the Better Housing League and other reform groups passed building codes, zoning laws, and subdivision regulations to keep out the unwanted. These regulations structured the framework within which residential development took place in Cincinnati. Zoning laws proved to be the most powerful of these regulatory mechanisms. Footnote. Enacted in 1924, Cincinnati's comprehensive zoning law created 3 different types of residential areas. Class A, reserved land exclusively for single-family homes. Class B, permitted both 2 and 4 family detached housing. Class C allowed for neighborhoods where any type of house could be built. The zoning law codified the city's emerging class-stratified residential environment and legally reinforced the economic walls partitioning the various residential districts. See Chapter 6. Large numbers of African Americans arrived in Cincinnati when residential land use regulation, the rise of homeownership, and market forces were producing neighborhoods stratified on the basis of housing cost and type. The emergence of this type of residential environment in combination with the low incomes of blacks and racism produced the ghetto. Footnote. The residential options of black Cincinnatians were severely limited by their low incomes. Much of the new owner-occupied and rental housing units were beyond their economic reach. The residential land rent structure then forced the majority of African Americans to search for housing in the low rent district located in the west end of the basin. By 1930, more than 30,000 blacks, comprising 67% of the African American population, lived there. The concentration of thousands of blacks in this part of the city caused a ghetto to form. See Chapter 6. The West End was not simply a ghetto. It was also a slum. Housing here was the oldest and most dilapidated in the metropolis. When in 1913 members of the National Housing Association called housing in Cincinnati among the worst in the United States, they were referring to dwelling units found in the basin. The basin's metamorphosis into the region's economic center exacerbated the problem. Between 1900 and 1940, it became a land use conversion zone where hundreds of tenements were destroyed to make way for new development. Almost 50% of the buildings demolished in Cincinnati were found there, while 1/3 of the city's new factories, offices, and service shops had basin locations. The blending of omnipresent destruction and construction with a concentration of social problems caused the basin to become a very undesirable place to live. Not surprising, many blacks wanted to move from the ghetto to more stable residential locations. They wanted to find a good place to live and raise their families. See Chapter 6. A major goal of the housing reformers was to keep poor blacks confined to the basin. By restricting cheap housing to specific zones, and by having visiting social workers and housekeepers encourage blacks not to move into white neighborhoods, reformers hoped to keep African Americans living in the ghetto slum. Their activities were complemented by realtors and white homeowners who likewise wanted to confine blacks to segregated neighborhoods. Class melded with race to determine where the metropolis African Americans lived. Thus, a combination of the city's physical structure, public policy, economic forces, and racism gave birth to the ghetto slum. See Chapters 6 and 7. It should be stressed that ghetto slum formation was more complex than the mere separation of blacks and whites in physical space. It involved the segregation of blacks and whites in very different types of neighborhoods. Uneven development is the concept that best describes the emergent differentials between the living place occupied by blacks and whites. Footnote. Blacks increasingly lived in a residential environment characterized by dilapidated housing, congestion, crime, and a proliferation of social problems. Whites increasingly lived in a residential environment characterized by good housing, amenities, safety, and stable neighborhood conditions. Footnote. The emergence of a ghetto slum led to a shift in thinking about the relationship between place and behavior. Before the ghetto slum, people did not believe that such a relationship existed. Now, they argued that the ghetto slum not only identified the place where African Americans lived in the city, it also defined their behavior. Footnote. The West End was a material reflection of the attitudes, values, beliefs, and traditions of Black Cincinnatians, not simply the location of their community. This interweaving of place and culture made it appear that African Americans were responsible for the blight and social problems found in their neighborhoods. This is what the newspaper editor and Black chronicler Wendell P. Dabney had in mind when he said, "The whites claim that the property of the locality depreciates in value when Negroes become residents. That cause for such depreciation rises from the Negro's failure to keep his property up to the right standard, the neglect of its appearance, his tendency to make money by subletting his rooms to irresponsible people who lower the tone of as well as become a nuisance to the neighborhood. Whenever one Negro comes, the others feel they have the right to follow, and that while the first comer may be all right, those who follow will be the opening wedge for a number of undesirables with their business signs for hair straightening, toilet preparations, and furnished rooms." Footnote. In essence, the idea was that whenever African Americans go within the metropolis, they will reproduce the ghetto slum. Let me read that again. In essence, the idea was that wherever African Americans go within the metropolis, they will reproduce the ghetto slum. This linking of culture to place and the fear that Black people blight neighborhoods fueled the residential segregation movement and exacerbated race relations. Not all Blacks lived in the ghetto slum. Some escaped. Footnote. More than 1/3 were scattered across the city, and in predominantly white residential settings, these Blacks built small residential clusters similar to those that existed in the Antebellum period. A number of low-income Blacks even moved into the suburban region where they built cruise. Footnote. To the housing reformers, these communities of homeowners were bad spots that threatened the suburban residential development. But to the people who resided there, the shacks were home sweet home. So then, in the city, residential land was regulated, placed homeownership beyond the economic reach of many blacks, and limited their housing options, while in the suburb, the lack of such regulation brought ownership, home ownership, and stable communities within the grasp of the poor, albeit on cheaply developed land with wobbly houses. Footnote. The reformers' emphasis on promoting homeownership and regulating residential land use did not mean that they eschewed the housing problem of low-income workers. On the contrary, attacking the low-income housing problem was an important part of their residential development strategy. The reformers believed that dilapidated housing, congestion, and slums produced anomie and bad citizens. Such conditions, they posited, threatened Cincinnati's economic, social, and political well-being. Based on this perspective, they formed a strategy centering on the goal of building both houses and communities that produce good citizens, imbued with the middle-class values of hard work and participatory democracy. But in spite of the reformers' lofty goals, their housing program failed. It did not create good housing and neighborhoods for low-income workers. See Chapter 7. The reasons are complex. Racism and business creed and the reformers' economic goal of transforming the basin into the economic center of the metropolis conflicted with and canceled out their social goal of building good housing and neighborhoods for low-income workers. During the teens and 20s, their strategy consisted of using building codes and constructing model tenements to provide housing for low-income workers. But code enforcement led to the demolition of hundreds of tenements without the simultaneous construction of new dwelling units to house displaced residents. Since blacks were overrepresented in the worst housing units, and since most blacks could not afford either the new owner or rental occupied houses, the restrictive legislation movement increased crowding and exacerbated the black housing problem. Footnote. In response to the inability of blacks to purchase new housing, the reformers developed a filtered down housing strategy. White workers were encouraged to move out of the West End so that their old housing could provide lodging for blacks. For instance, when black leaders and members of the Cincinnati Community Chest asked the Better Housing League to develop a plan for addressing the worsening black housing problem, they were told that the Friends of African Americans should be encouraged to invest their money in the building of new houses for whites. This, the Better Housing League indicated, this is a quote, while not relieving colored families directly, would tend to relieve them indirectly by drawing white families out of the district now occupied, for the most part, by colored people. End quote. Footnote. The big problem with this scheme is that most housing was ready for demolition by the time it filtered down to low-income blacks. Moreover, the reformers, by encouraging white flight, reinforced the emerging pattern of racial residential segregation in the West End. See Chapter 7. In the 1930s and 1940s, the effort to provide good housing and neighborhoods for low-income workers shifted from the private to the public housing front. The Great Depression led to a federally supported public housing program designed to replace crowded, insanitary slum housing with good housing and neighborhoods for the poor. By clearing slums and rehousing the poor in low-rent housing units, reformers hoped to create vibrant neighborhoods where people mired in poverty were redeemed. But again, racism and the business creed thwarted their efforts. See Chapter 7. Housing officials divided the city's low-income population into two groups, the deserving and the undeserving poor. The undeserving poor, according to the housing reformers, lived in those sections of the slum where housing was the most dilapidated and where social problems were most heavily concentrated. These places, they posited, not only identified where the undeserving poor resided, but reflected their behavior as well. Nothing could be done for the individuals in this group. They were best left to the social workers, the police, and the courts. In contrast, the deserving poor, reformers believed, were either newcomers to the city or workers temporarily down on their luck. They could be helped. See Chapter 7. Consistent with their philosophy of homogeneous neighborhoods, reformers felt that the deserving and undeserving poor should be separated in geographic space, lest the latter adversely affect the former. Within this context, the reformers sought to rehabilitate the deserving poor by bringing them into a public housing environment where strong communities were to be established. Since the majority of the white poor were members of the deserving poor, and the majority of the black poor were not, it only made sense. The housing leaders probably reasoned to build most of the new public housing units in the white section of the West End and in the white-dominated areas of the metropolis. In this regard, housing authorities attempted to use public housing as a means of solving the housing problem of low-income whites. Footnote: Black admission to public housing was further curbed by high minimum income requirements and rentals. Public housing's goal was to furnish the poor with a supply of low-rent housing, but the cost of land acquisition, demolition, and construction pushed the cost of living in these units beyond the economic reach of most blacks. See Chapter 7. In the end, public housing, like tenement regulation and model homes, failed to provide African Americans with good housing and neighborhood conditions. Consequently, the ghetto slum persisted. One response to the formation of the ghetto slum in housing and the housing problem, the growth of socioeconomic problems among blacks, and persistent racism, was the emergence of a black social welfare movement. See Chapter 8. Within this context, the black sociologist and social worker assumed great importance. They became frontline workers grappling with the complex social and economic problems confronting African Americans on a day-to-day basis. They played a central role in helping blacks survive the city. The sociologist and the social worker represented a new type of black leader. Coming out of the Progressive era's social justice movement, these leaders sought to apply the new methods of the social sciences to the analysis and resolution of social and economic problems facing African Americans. The Progressive era social reformers believed that the problems facing blacks were not caused by their innate racial inferiority, but by racism, lack of training, and society's failure to provide them with adequate education, health services, housing, and stable neighborhoods. All these causes, they believed, were susceptible to improvement through organized social reform. Therefore, they placed great emphasis on the use of careful study or investigation as the foundation upon which to build the reform movement. Footnote: The idea of cultural pluralism guided the activities of both black and white social reformers. This viewpoint conceptualized the United States as having one culture that was composed of a series of equal or potentially equal racial and ethnic groups, each with its own subcultures. In many ways, the notion of cultural pluralism seemed to be an ideological reflection of the new urban form, with its segregated patterns and land uses and its residential environment partitioned on the basis of homogeneous neighborhoods. It seemed both to explain and justify the separation of racial and ethnic groups along with the various social classes in physical space. See Chapter 8. The Black sociologist James Hathaway Robinson and the Negro Civic Welfare Committee were the driving forces behind the Black social welfare movement in Cincinnati during the 1920s and 30s and 40s. For Robinson and his contemporaries, improved race relations and the alleviation of social and economic problems among Blacks did not mean racial integration, but rather the development of Black institutions and the ability of African Americans to influence the larger pluralistic community. Robinson saw no contradiction in the building of a strong African American community and the participation of Blacks as a group in the larger Cincinnati community. To him, the internal development and strengthening of the Black community did not mean segregation or separation and social isolation. Based on this viewpoint, Robinson developed a two-pronged approach to organizing the Black community, strengthening it internally and also making it an equal participant in the larger metropolitan community. See Chapter 8, footnote. Robinson and the quintessential social reformer initiated the city's Black social welfare movement with a detailed survey of the Black community that described the social and economic problems facing Black Cincinnati and the nature of social work among Blacks. Robinson then used this information along with the founding of the Negro Civic Welfare Committee, which he headed, to guide the social welfare movement in Cincinnati for 3 decades. The Negro Civic Welfare Committee represented a new type of organization in Black Cincinnati. What made it novel was its centralizing and coordinating role. Under Robinson's leadership, it guided the work of all social agencies operating in the African American community. Robinson even sought to bring the social welfare activities of the churches and other Black institutions under its umbrella. This centralization of work, he believed, was one key to addressing the myriad problems faced by the race. Focusing on the everyday problems facing African Americans, however, did not blind him to the broader issues of racism and race relations. He believed that educating whites on the history and plight of Blacks was central to improving race relations and creating a climate of opinion that would facilitate the struggle of African Americans. This is a new section. We're still in the introduction. The post-industrial city, urban change and protest. The Second World War ushered in a third period in the development of Cincinnati and the Black community. In this period, Black population growth, slum clearance, superhighway construction, and the rise of the metropolis led to the formation of a second ghetto in the once exclusive hilltop region of Cincinnati. The war triggered a second wave of Blacks who left the South for the North in the Great Migration. Between 1940 and 1970, Cincinnati's Black population more than doubled as it jumped from 55,593 to 125,070, and Blacks as a proportion of the total population grew from 12 to 28%. As Blacks moved into the city, an even greater number of whites moved out. In the post-war era, the suburban region became the center of neighborhood development and population growth in Metro Cincinnati. Slum clearance in the basin and superhighway construction marched a tandem with the demographic changes. Both projects required the clearance of large sections of the West End. In the 1940s and 1950s, the demolition of housing units displaced so many people that it scattered the population, especially African Americans. The destruction of hundreds of housing units at a time of significant population increase created a housing shortage. By 1943, vacancies in the basin were almost non-existent. The West End black population had no choice but to deconcentrate. With existing black neighborhoods bulging at their seams, old patterns of residential segregation began to break down as blacks began to move into hilltop and valley neighborhoods. The black housing crunch and the white exodus to the suburbs led to an easing of racial restriction on real estate mortgages and a new willingness among realtors to sell and rent houses and apartments to blacks in previously all-white neighborhoods. In many ways, the black invasion of the white hilltop and valley neighborhoods was a new variation of the old trickle-down housing theory. As whites vacated their used central city housing for new suburban housing and neighborhoods, blacks moved in. Still, the process of neighborhood change generated racial tensions. Some realtors and property owners tried to keep their neighborhoods all white, and when blacks did move into these communities, they faced hostility. Another source of tension came from the blockbusting activities of realtors. Blockbusters used a variety of tactics to pressure whites in a target area to sell their homes. The resulting panic contributed both to the neighborhood change and racial tension. Although the dispersed black population moved into different neighborhoods in the city and suburbs, their primary destination was the Walnut Hills, Avondale section of the city. Before 1940, this area had been a haven for middle-income blacks. As a matter of fact, my grandfather, the Pullman porter, and grandmother lived in Avondale, and my brother lives in their house now in Avondale. They had one child, my mother, so they had expendable money. My grandmother didn't work. She was a stay-at-home mom, and my grandfather worked on the railroad. So before 1940, this area had been a haven for middle-income blacks. After the war, it became the center of black population growth and the place where a second ghetto formed. Ironically, during the 1950s, as the second ghetto formed, housing reformers ended their support for residential segregation and suggested that the creation of integrated neighborhoods might help to relieve housing congestion in the basin. Blacks and poor whites did not cause slums, they argued. Poverty and racial segregation did. Whoa, duh. This way, as the income and educational level of blacks improved, they could move out of the ghetto slum. This approach would enable African Americans to climb the same housing and neighborhood ladder as whites. Footnote: the fight for open housing and integrated neighborhoods became a new tactic for combating the consequences of living in a ghetto slum. Nevertheless, income still played the principal role in determining where most blacks lived. African Americans moved into those neighborhoods where they could afford the housing. And with a relaxation of building codes and zoning regulations in those neighborhoods undergoing change, housing conditions worsened. Footnote: consequently, the neighborhoods experiencing the highest degree of integration were those neighborhoods adjacent to neighborhoods undergoing rapid changeover from white to black occupancy. Thus, as Cincinnati's new ghetto emerged in the Walnut Hill, Avondale area, the neighborhoods located on the ghetto's outer perimeter became the most integrated in the city. Footnote: the influx of blacks into northern cities during the 40s increased racial tensions and created an atmosphere where the threat of violence was omnipresent. Then Detroit exploded on June 20th, 1943. When peace was restored, 25 African Americans and 9 whites were found to have been killed. Property valued at several $100,000 had been destroyed. In response to the riot, Many cities across the country, including Cincinnati, made efforts to prevent interracial violence. On October 7, 1943, an interracial delegation led by the executive directors of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, and the Community Chest Division of Negro Welfare, Harold Snell and Arnold Walker, met with Mayor James G. Stewart to discuss establishing a politically independent organization to fight for the protection of minorities. Both the mayor and city council supported the idea, and on November 17th, the council passed a resolution authorizing the creation of a committee on race relations, known as the Mayor's Friendly Relations Committee, MFRC. See Chapter 10. The concept of cultural pluralism determined the structure and function of the MFRC. By promoting tolerance for cultural diversity, the MFRC sought to minimize tensions between groups and to keep violence from breaking out in Cincinnati. Although this goal forced it to address the issues of prejudice and discrimination, the MFRC's definition of pluralism caused it to formulate an action program based on the concept of neutrality. The MFRC would not champion the cause of any single group. Thus, shortly after its formation, it stated that it was not a Black advocacy group. Yet, as an official arm of city government charged with the responsibility of reducing interracial tension, preventing racial violence, and promoting harmony among all citizens, the MFRC helped to create an environment that aided the Black protest movement. The MFRC's role in this was not accidental. The MFRC formed at a time when Blacks were beginning to step up their struggle to desegregate public places and to end racial discrimination in hiring. And African Americans worked to involve the MFRC at some level in their own struggle. See Chapter 10. Blacks had their own interpretation of cultural pluralism. They believed, as did whites, that American society consisted of varied racial and ethnic groups, each with its own culture. Theoretically, these groups existed on a horizontal plane, with no one group superior to the others, but Blacks felt that racism bred inequities that kept them from competing with whites. This meant that the cultural pluralism ideal could be realized only through struggle. Indeed, based on activities of James Hathaway Robinson and other Black leaders, cultural pluralism became a variant of Black nationalist ideology. To them, the philosophy meant building and developing Black Cincinnati while fighting against the forces that kept Blacks economically, politically, and socially unequal. Footnote: the MFRC did not actively participate in the Black protest movement, and it carefully avoided taking any stand that might be interpreted as supporting Blacks, and refused to engage in any activity that might increase racial tension. Even so, the MFRC spent most of its time grappling with issues that divided Blacks and whites. Whenever racial tensions heated up, the MFRC tried to put out the fire. For example, in 1944 and 1945, when Blacks began to challenge racial discrimination in employment and in public places, the MFRC served as an honest broker to reconcile differences and to minimize the possibility of violence. In 1946, when racial violence threatened to explode following the alleged rape of a white woman by 4 Black men, the MFRC labored to defuse the racial time bomb. They launched an educational campaign and worked with ministers, civic leaders, and others to create an atmosphere of calm and reason. To change anti-Negro attitudes among the police, the MFRC established a race relations detail within the police department and promoted the idea of providing policemen with training in minority problems. When Blacks sought housing in all-white neighborhoods and racial tensions boiled, the MFRC made efforts to cool down the situation. See Chapter 10. The MFRC's success in combating prejudicial thinking and discriminatory practices is debatable. but its effectiveness in helping to bring about conditions that facilitated the Black protest movement is not. Indeed, its crusade to assuage racial tensions and promote cultural diversity might explain why the civil rights movement did not generate as much violence in the North as it did in the South. Finally, the MFRC's role in the protest movement demonstrates the complex way in which Blacks approached their struggle. African Americans did not simply join the MFRC and adopt its program. They brought their own agenda there and sought to impose it on the MFRC, and to a degree they were successful. This suggests that African Americans recognize the need for different types of organizations and for different approaches to their struggle. Although tensions existed among organizations aiding the Black cause, and although many had varying ideologies and agendas, their activities were nevertheless complementary. Some marched, demonstrated, picketed, and harangued. Some strategized, petitioned, and legislated. And still others worked quietly behind the scenes, educating, negotiating, and pleading the case for change. But regardless of the approach, their collective action pushed forward the struggle for civil rights. One Black organization that believed in working behind the scenes during these turbulent years was the Cincinnati Urban League, see Chapter 11. Shortly after its founding in 1948, the Cincinnati Urban League launched a struggle against hiring discrimination, which was a bastion of the colored caste occupational system. A secondary goal of the League was to stop the practice of companies refusing to promote Blacks when they did hire them. In most businesses and industries, African Americans were confined to entry-level jobs when they were hired. Blacks were excluded from many jobs in the city. For example, in 1948, half of the companies in Cincinnati, each of which employed more than 1,500 workers, did not hire Blacks. Those that did employed them only in menial jobs. For example, only 50 of the telephone company's 3,000 workers were African Americans, and they all had low-wage jobs. Most companies had policies that stress job promotion on the basis of race, not merit. So when Blacks did get jobs in large companies, they remained locked in entry-level positions. See Chapter 11. Dismantling the color caste occupational system became the League's top priority. To spearhead its job program, the Cincinnati Urban League established an industrial relations program headed by Francis L. Dowdell, a graduate of the Atlanta University School of Social Science. The program used quiet diplomacy, featuring behind-the-scenes negotiations and a willingness to compromise, to attack the color caste occupational system. Dowdell and the Cincinnati Urban League leaders met with select heads of business and industry and urged them to hire Blacks and to upgrade workers on the basis of merit, not race. Concurrently, the League recruited qualified workers, prepared them for the desegregation experience, and tried to find them jobs. The League believed that once a company broke the color line, it would hire other Blacks. Those breaking the color line then represented a wedge of opportunity for the workers who would follow. Breaking the job color barrier was the goal, and quiet diplomacy and means. See Chapter 11. Between 1948 and 1953, the year of my birth, 1953, the League perfected its behind-the-scenes approach to Black protest. It would start by establishing a close working relationship with the heads of a given community. Then, the Cincinnati Urban League used quiet persuasion to convince the owners to hire or promote Blacks. The League experienced some success with this method. 5 years after starting the program, it had placed 523 workers in jobs that had previously been closed to blacks. This process was slow, but the Urban League believed that agitation and confrontation would not open doors marked for whites only. Gradualism was the only variable option. The League remained wedded to behind-the-scenes activities. As activity on the civil rights front stepped up, the Urban League extended its behind-the-scenes approach to other arenas. The lengthy fight to desegregate Coney Island, Cincinnati's major amusement park, is a model of how the Urban League operated during the stormy 50s. The struggle to desegregate Coney Island lasted 9 years and involved a broad coalition including the NAACP, the Cincinnati Committee on Human Rights, which is an affiliate of the Congress of Racial Equality, the Black Church, the Jewish Community Relations Committee, and the Civil Liberties Union. In 1952, when the conflict broke out, the League, based on a recommendation to Coney Island officials from the MFRC, became involved in the struggle. Throughout the prolonged fight, the League worked behind the scenes, educating, persuading, negotiating, and constantly speaking about the struggle's negative consequences. As the League talked, other organizations engaged in more aggressive activities. The NAACP went to court, harangued, and joined with other groups that repeatedly sought entry to the park, even though they were repeatedly denied admission. Direct action was used in the fight to desegregate the Coney Island swimming pool and dance hall. Finally, on May 27, 1961, the long battle ended. A decision was made to desegregate all facilities at Coney Island beginning on May 30th. See Chapter 11. I don't know if Marion Spencer was part of the Urban League, but I know that she was instrumental. She had something to do with the desegregation of Coney Island, and she still lives today. The League played an important role in this struggle. Its success, however, depended on two factors. First, the League relied on the cooperation of white power brokers. The Urban League always asked, it never demanded. And the Urban League retreated whenever it encountered stiff resistance. So whenever it could not convince power brokers that it was in their best interest to end discrimination, progress stalled. Second, the militancy of groups that did not participate in quiet diplomacy created conditions favorable to behind-the-scenes activity. The aggressiveness of troublemakers, quote unquote, pressured power brokers into negotiating with groups like the Urban League. Their demonstrating, picketing, petitioning, and haranguing made the power brokers want to discuss the issue with responsible, quote unquote, leaders. This suggested that victories on the civil rights front were usually caused by the complementary activities, conscious or unconscious, of a number of different organizations. Thus, only by viewing organizations within the context of other groups can their role be the protest movement. Can their role in the protest movement be fully understood and appreciated? Okay, this is the conclusion of the introduction. On June 13, 1967, Black Cincinnati exploded. Riots took place in the communities of Avondale, Walnut Hills, Evanston, Corryville, Mount Auburn, Clifton, Millville, and the West End. Footnote: the anger and deep frustration that led to the fires, acts of hoodlumism, looting, and anarchy are best captured in Langston Hughes's poem, Harlem. What happened to a dream deferred? What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or does it explode? Footnote: inquiries into the cause of the riot pinpointed unemployment, bad housing, poor neighborhood conditions, and the lack of political representation. Footnote: More than 140 years had passed since blacks first settled in Cincinnati. During that period, the battle for civil rights, political representation, decent housing and neighborhood conditions, and jobs and opportunities had been constant themes. As the city moved through the commercial and industrial eras and into the post-industrial age, the nature of the problems facing blacks changed, and so too did the organizations fighting for advancement. Race and class defined the position of blacks in Cincinnati's plural but unequal society. Prejudicial thinking, discrimination, segregation, and location on the economic margin determined the life chances of African Americans in every stage in Cincinnati's development. Through the years, African Americans fought to control their own destiny and to change their location in Cincinnati's social, economic, and political order. Blacks marched, demonstrated, picketed, harangued, and worked behind the scenes to educate, plead their case, and negotiate. They formed organizations that protested and agitated and grappled with the complex day-to-day problems of the race. They also formed social clubs, fraternities, sororities, and secret societies that reinforced cultural bonds and enabled them to enjoy a life apart from whites. Over time, racism changed. The doors of opportunity once closed opened, and blacks, once highly concentrated, were scattered across the city. Many moved from the river bottoms to the hilltops and valleys, while others settled in the suburban hinterland. The ranks of the middle class and higher paid workers swelled. The idea of segregation gave way to integration, and open, hostile forms of racism retreated. Yet, on several hot summer nights in 1967, as hundreds of National Guardsmen and city policemen, armed with rifles, pistols, and machine guns, roamed through black sections of Cincinnati, as armored tanks roared up and down the streets, and as angry young blacks burned, looted, and marauded, it seemed remarkable how much things had changed, yet remained the same. Footnote: most blacks remained confined to the bottom of the job market. Unemployment became a big problem. African Americans lived in dilapidated houses and run-down neighborhoods, and family stability tottered. In retrospect, the riot was both an epilogue and prologue of the black experience in Cincinnati. It summarized decades of having dreams deferred, of living in a world where things seemed immutable, fixed in time and space. It introduced the dawning of a new era when unemployment and underemployment, declining participation in the labor force, poverty, and the rise of an underclass and catastrophic social problems would replace civil rights as the dominant issues on the black agenda for advancement. Footnote. So that's the end of the introduction, and it has about 7 pages of footnotes, just taking you to the sources of the information from which they got he wrote this introduction. So, needless to say, this book is a wealth of information. As I said before, I was born in 1953. So I am not very far removed from especially what's going on in the 60s. But I can recall from conversations and just being around my parents and grandparents, what life was like for them. And again, my parents, my mother, not my father lived in the West End on Bar Street, had 7 siblings, and they came up from the South, although I believe he was born here in Cincinnati, as was my mother, born in Cincinnati. And my grandfather, I believe he was born in Kentucky, Newport, just over the river. But my grandmother, my mother's mother, came up from Yadkin County. I believe that's South Carolina. here to Cincinnati with her family. She came from a large family, and my grandfather came from a large family, but they had only one child. So that is what enabled them to be considered quote unquote middle class and move to Avondale and not have to live in the basin because they had only one mouth to feed. And my grandfather worked on the railroad, which was a good job back at that time. So I'll interject some more things about my family as we move through this book, but I hope that you're enjoying it. I hope that you will get it and read it for yourself. Race and the City, published in 1993, but the history is simply phenomenal, and it just turns the light on for me for several things. I just wish I had the time to go through these footnotes and actually secure some of these resources, because I'm feeling that some of these resources may contain some of the data and information that I am looking for, but I simply do not have the time to go through all this. So next time I will read, and it looks like the introduction is also chapter 1, because then we go to chapter 2, and William Creek and Amy Lee Creek are the writers of this essay, and the title of it is John Mercer Langston and the Cincinnati Riot of 1841. So I hope that this will also talk about the other riots in Cincinnati prior to 41. I think there was one in like 34 or 32. Where it wasn't black people rioting, it was white people coming against black people because the black people were moving in and taking their jobs, or they feared that they would. So I'm looking forward to going forward in this book with you, and my goodness, again, just footnote. It looks like the footnotes in this chapter 2 are almost equal to the actual essay itself. So these are well-researched essays, and I'm just excited to read through it. So thanks so much for joining me. Be blessed, and we'll see you next time.